Have you ever done something that was like basically perfect and then you found out you had to do it again because you didn't hit the record button? Well, that's never happened to me. And welcome back to How to Be a Better DM. Also, my name is Justin Lewis, and that was a lie. That did happen to me. This is the second time we are bringing on our guest, Ashley May King, to record with us. The first episode that we recorded together is lost to the void of mystery. We'll never get that back.
It
But
was so good.
it was so good, and I'm so sorry that I didn't
We'll
get it
never
on.
know.
We'll never know. But
Yeah.
listener, you are so lucky because she has overlooked my mistake, and I've brought Tanner on today as my adult supervision. We're gonna have a fun conversation with Ashley May King again about, you know, Roman gods. So, what do you think?
I'm totally down. I could talk about this for a uncomfortable amount of time. How much time do we have?
Well, I guess let's not waste any time and just hop right
Mm.
in. But before we do, Tanner, I forgot to say hello to you. So, how you doing, Tanner?
Hey Justin, I'm here too. I wasn't here on the last recording, and I think that's what went wrong
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
personally. But
You're right.
yeah, I did hear that they laughed, they cried, that it made them want to be better people. So
True.
hopefully that happens with this one too.
Yeah. It it really did make me want to be better, especially after I realized that I didn't get the recording.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So on this episode of How to Be a Better Podcaster, we hit record.
that was
Lesson learned.
boom, done.
Write that down. Write that down.
Exactly. But today, like I said, we are joined by Ashley May King. A little bit of background information. She is a very talented writer for horror and mystery games of all sorts. She mostly plays Call of Cthulhu, but today we're going to try and dissect. Well, she's going to unravel her mysteries of how to, provide an awesome horror game. But before we get to that, Ashley, what is something that you've been geeking out about lately?
Listen, I am such a nerd for theology, mythology. I love finding obscure religions, and I stumbled upon this really fascinating Roman god of waypoints and of boundary markers named Terminus. This was a god they would have sacrifices to, and it feels like it's such a random kind of benign thing, these like boundary markers, but it had its own following. He had, you know followers make sacrifices to him. It's just, I love that kind of thing. Just you never know what's out there, and then you never know how that can inspire something in a game sometime. I feel like I get a lot of inspiration from.
Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. So like when you say sacrifices, like since he's got a waypoints like street signs, like they'd burn, crossroad
Or
street signs
steel
or
stop signs?
steel
It's
stop signs.
it's a lot darker than that. I
Okay.
don't know what the rating is on this particular podcast, but if you
Go ahead.
want to read some R-rated, okay, great. Yeah, no, they would burn people tied to these like boundary markers and like leave uh their ashes to kind of like, I don't know, consecrate the new boundary or such. No, they were killing people. Or,
Woof.
perhaps animals and such, but yeah, you gotta really lock it in.
Yeah. That's nuts. Can you
Man.
imagine that, but with like the HOAs and neighborhoods of today where it's like you have a
Oh
fence
my
that's
god.
2 feet over and good night, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I love it.
Hot dang. And yeah, I just in my mind I'm like, thank goodness they brought it around because when you're like, oh, they burned people, I was like, what does that have to do with waypoints? And you're like, oh, they'd be tied to these boundary markers. I was like, okay, they brought it around, they made it relevant. Good on
Exactly. They
them.
were,
Topical.
yeah, yeah.
I
They
love
weren't
it.
just, in a different third location burning.
I love it.
Thank
Um,
heavens.
well, that actually brings me to my next question. which is also unrelated to horror. If you guys were the gods of something, just like something random, what would you be?
Pizza.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Dang, that's
Yeah, guys, I've always been into making pizza. Recently, my wife went all out for Christmas. She got me a bunch of pizza stuff and like a pizza cookbook, and I made a really good margarita pizza. Like the dough is so
Best kind.
good. I know. But anyway, I made a like just off the top of my head, I came up with a recipe for a Philly cheesesteak pizza that tasted like Philly cheesesteak
what?
using leftovers I had. I was so proud, and I would be a great god of pizza.
Agreed.
I would follow you. I would burn people in your honor
Just hey,
in a
if you're gonna
pizza
burn
oven.
people, if you're gonna do it, make sure you're preheating that oven for at least 50 minutes at the highest temperature that your oven will go. So yeah.
I think I would be the god of getting stickers off of things without leaving any residue. That's my special skill, and I feel like it's so niche. And I would want to be the god of something just so obscure and specific. And that is like, if I think about the things I'm most proud of myself for, that hits the top 5. I can get stickers off of anything without leaving any of that sticky stuff. It's all in the angle. You got to go 45-degree angle.
45-degree angle. Do you take
What the
commissions?
heck?
I, you know, I'm happy. I get so satisfied doing it. You want to mail me something? I'll take a sticker off anytime. I got you.
Oh, that's amazing.
Oh
Uh,
man, now I'm thinking about all the like, you know how when you buy a new container or like, Tupperware or something, it has stickers on the bottom sometimes. And then like it gets washed and it just smears and everything. Now I'm just like, oh gosh, that'd be a really useful skill.
Yeah,
that'd be
it's
amazing.
got to go low, slow, and at a 45-degree angle. You got it.
See, I don't have the patience for that. I always just get, I gotta get to the end and I rip it off. Um, and honestly, I actually think that might be one of my personal struggles with writing mysteries and horrors. I don't
Mm.
have the patience to work through the problem. So let's figure out how to do this right. So, if you could just tell us the secrets to writing the perfect horror or mystery or both game.
Yeah, in
Yeah,
2 sentences, please. Just two sentences.
sure thing. Sure thing. 2 sentences. Start at the end and have your own timeline. It's funny
I
that
was
you mentioned,
joking. That was great.
but
That was
that's
awesome.
really kind of what it boils down to, right? Like you mentioned not wanting, like the problem being this thing to solve. I like to start at the problem and at like the big, I like to start at my enemy winning and what that looks like and what apocalyptic kind of hellscape follows and kind of, set the stakes there. Um, I don't spend too much time defining what that enemy is at that point. In all of my game notes, I just call it the entity, and then I'll find it later. I'll name it. I'll describe it. I'll come up with some cool abilities, etc. But I don't need to know that starting out. I just need to know what it wants, and then you can work your way back from there. I think a lot of times, if you work from the beginning, you get really caught up, especially in mystery, with cause and effect, and this clue leads to this clue leads to this clue, and that can be very challenging once you bring other people into the game and they're not quite following the pattern that makes the most sense to you. So if you start from the end and if you establish the timeline of what the entity is doing, regardless of the player interaction, you're always going to be on track. And so I picture it as these two kind of parallel timelines, one that the players are on and one that your entity is making happen. And they are naturally going to cross paths at certain points in that timeline. But you don't have to necessarily define that, because if you know what your enemy or entity is doing, you can roll with that whenever the players are going to come up with uh, come into that world or see the results of it or anything like that. I find that that's a lot easier. And I only say that because I have done it. I started out doing it the opposite way, and trying to be so scripted with everything. Like, oh, I will present this, this will happen, and then the players, they'll definitely say this, to which I can respond with this, and then it immediately goes off script and you're panicking. But if you give yourself that room of just being confident in the order of operations of what's happening regardless of the players, that too also plays into that helplessness a little bit, that you want them to feel, that like futile kind of, like that futility of being up against something so beyond your means and so beyond yourself that yeah, when and it makes it so much more satisfying when you do have influence over what's happening or how that entity is achieving or not achieving its aims. That's my like super condensed kind of advice, and it really does. It boils down to two things: start from the end and have your own timeline.
I have to say, I really like that because I think it taught me something about horror
Mm.
in the way that, because when you were like, hey, have two kind of tracks, two different timelines, what the players do, and that's, decided by them and you during the session. But then separately, you've been like, hey, this is what the entity, the creature, whatever it is doing, and its goal leads to what it's doing.
I was
uh,
I was gonna comment. I think that is so adorable. So for the podcast listener, there are two cats behind Ashley that are currently.
They are battling it out.
It's amazing.
It's
it's
I'm so
they're
sorry.
crushing it.
No
It's
problem
so
at all.
cute.
No problem. Anyways, Tanner, go ahead.
But like I realized, I was like, wait, so why is that different from a normal
Mm.
antagonist? Because I was thinking, I was like, normal antagonists also are powerful. Maybe you don't understand them, maybe you do, but theoretically they're doing their own thing. But then I was like, are they? Think about most stories. Most of the time, it's like, oh, the enemy has done something,
Hmm.
and the players find out, and like it's almost like the enemy is static, and the
Hmm.
players are approaching them on their own timeline, right? For the most part, with a couple exceptions. I think with horror, especially where you're trying to make it so that it's something, so that the players are scared by the unknown, and
Hmm.
also they're like terrified by like, oh, this could happen to me at any time. You kind of need a more proactive antagonist.
Absolutely. If you're waiting for these certain triggers, like in a haunted house, to go, then you're going to end up with a lot of dead space when the players aren't quite they're not stepping on the traps that you set so cleverly, because it's not a horror movie, it's not scripted. They're not going to go in the basement if they hear a noise, even though it is really fun in horror games. And I do find that players often play into those tropes a lot,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a fun way to do it. And always reward your players if they play into a horror movie trope. They should learn something from it. But yeah, there is an opportunity in horror to let the story also drive the fear in your players, that there are things happening that they don't know about, and that they are late to the game almost, and like trying to catch up, and that leads to this like real life anxiety that kind of like carries over into that fear. um yeah, I think I was trying to think before this recording why I like horror so much, because I feel like everything that I write has a very horror basis. And I think that is what I enjoy so much about it, is there is so much autonomy in the story and in the mm, evil forces or the through line, through the like inciting action is the same thing as your enemy, basically. But you have so much autonomy with that to then use that as a driving force. And also, I mean, I will say the very first time that you run a horror game and like you see people physically recoil from the table, that's also a really satisfying feeling. And I think in a sick way, I love that so much. I enjoy that so much more than people laughing like at something. Like I want to see them like have a visceral reaction to things. But yeah, it does give you a lot of mm, as a writer, it gives you a lot of control over the story without it feeling like you're railroading or putting anything on too narrow of tracks. Because that's just the nature of it. You're fighting against something, and that something is has its own aims and has its own process and markers and desires and things it will avoid, and that just like it all wraps up into a really nice world to throw people in.
I think one thing that strikes me the most is this process that you described. It aligns so well with horror
Mm.
because of like the feel of the process is horror, right?
Mhm.
This entity that seems like you don't have control of because they don't.
Mhm.
And to me, I mean, obviously, this isn't a horror principle that I'm going to say, but it speaks to the fact that you need to understand the game that you're giving, or maybe the story arc that you're giving, and plan accordingly, right? Like if you're doing a simple adventure or like a horror, or if it's political intrigue, the feel has to align with that, right? And that goes down to exactly what you said, the actions of the entity or the problem, and how that is making the players react or act. And I think that's so fascinating how you kind of caught on that, and you're just rinse and repeat, right?
Yeah, and it's I mean, it works as a starting point in pretty much any genre of horror or mystery too. Always work from the end in mystery. um or else you'll end up with I've literally tried like the red string on the wall kind of like to figure everything out, and it's just it turns into such a mess. Start from the end. But no, that's so right, and it applies so easily to whatever setting that it's in, whether it's, gothic horror and you're in like a Victorian haunted mansion, or it's something more modern and visceral, like a theme park with like murderous clowns, or whatever it's going to be, you can still apply that idea to that setting. And that's a good starting point to at least get you out of being stuck with defining everything early on, because that's where I found I would often get hung up, is trying to just write out, okay, these are all my NPCs, these are all my monsters, these are all the things they can find and use, etc. But I didn't have any stake in what these things meant to the story at that point. I just wanted to come up with cool stuff. And then it was kind of tricky to then fit that in at like these misaligned puzzle pieces into the story I wanted to write. So letting one inform the other, I think, is a much more forgiving way to approach writing. And it gives you the sense of mm, you're able to shape a very satisfying narrative without having to have everything figured out. And the focus really should be on the narrative, at least, in the genres that I like to write for. Like, we like horror because it makes us feel something. And either that something is we leave it with unease, we leave it with catharsis, we leave it with hope, or we leave it with just like fear, like they're just the feeling that we need to look over our shoulder constantly. And so once you define what that is, what feeling you want to leave folks with, you can make a satisfying narrative and you can figure out how to shape that by knowing what note you're going to end on. Um, Kind of like how you can tell the key a song is by the last note that's played in it.
Hmm.
Uh, and so it's kind of that same thing, and you use that to inform uh, the rest of it. And yeah, I love focusing on kind of story structure and beats and making sure that it's very satisfying in that way.
So, as I was talking, I was like, I love all of this. I kind of want to get specific. Uh, so, do you have a favorite horror campaign that you've run?
I do. I'm really biased to the very first one that I wrote. It's gothic horror, it's Victorian mansion, it's lowlands of Scotland, it's changeling child, it's ghostly happenings, it's raining moors. Like it's a very evocative thing. And when I first wrote it, it was that thing where it was so scripted. Everything every NPC said, I had typed out, I had tried to anticipate what the players would say, and like it went off script, I think 2 sentences in, of course, and I panicked. Um, but now that's a scenario that I've used I guess train with Geek Therapeutics at times, and then use that as the scenario to teach therapists the game mechanics so they can use horror to heal and kind of give this sense of catharsis. So now I've run that, and I've run that scenario a few other times for a few streams and then like personal games. So now I think I've totally run it somewhere between 20 and 30 times. It's never ended the same way twice, ever, ever, ever. And that's the kind of thing. And I think I'm so connected to that story and I feel so passionate about it because it was such a learning process for me to then be excited about the fact that it is never going to end the same way. And with that uncertainty and sitting with that instead of, you know, a complete 180 from hyper scripting everything out to then expecting and looking forward to that difference and to things going off script and feeling comfortable in that setting. So yeah, I'm very partial to that one for a lot of reasons, I suppose. And also, I think gothic horror is my favorite genre of horror. I love Shirley Jackson. I love Mary Shelley, like, you know, the classics. And that they're just, those are stories that I remember sticking with me so much. And to kind of pay homage to that is, it just feels special.
Tanner, did you have a follow up question on that?
I mean, I have 1,000, but Justin, do you have a question?
I do. I do. This is less specific. Well, I guess kind of different type of specific. So, you say start at the end, and
Mhm.
I love that, and maybe I didn't understand the first time. But when you say the end, are you meaning like this is the resolution scene? This is everyone like leaving the haunted house, going home happy, or this is like the climax?
The climax, the oh shit, it all went wrong.
Mm,
Like worst case scenario for the players, best case scenario for the entity.
mm,
I start with the entity's win scenario as because that's their aim and
yeah.
that's what they fully expect to happen. So all of their actions are going to be informed by that expectation. Um, and so that is where I start from. And I always like to give my players, I aim for at the very minimum 3 different paths to resolution. Um, One, the entity wins, they lose, the apocalypse happens, they all die, whatever, whatever. I really like to situate them in uh, with a scenario where they call my bluff on that a lot of times. Um, love that. Love when the world ends when they're like, she's not gonna do it. Yes, I will. Um, so I have my entity wins apocalyptic scenario like ending. Then I think, okay, how can they solve this with the clues that I give them? And that informs what I need to put in this setting, what tools I need to drop in this haunted house, what intel. And so then I can come up with what it would take to thwart these plans. And so then those become my clues that they find either by their own discovery, or if you need an NPC to just hand them a piece of paper, just do it. The players need information sometimes. And there's a fun mechanic in Call of Cthulhu that I like to use for that I'll go into in a moment. So apocalyptic ending, they solve it, fantastic, thwart the plans, and then they always, and I say those, and that they always 9 times out of 10 go for the third option, which is violence. Which is, I think we play a lot of fantasy games. I think D&D is very much that like power, like hero fantasy type thing. And you think, oh, swing big sword, kill big monster, fantastic. And so I always give my players guns, and then they are useless. And that's just like a fun moment every single time, but it makes them feel, it emboldens them a little bit to make choices that maybe they wouldn't otherwise, but then makes the stakes even more real. So, but I do always work in a way to where violence could win this situation if you fight the right entity or fight this thing when it's like at its weak point before it becomes this thing, it ascends or whatever, or you use this certain material that can, like in the Victorian setting, if you use iron against Fae, then it actually like finds purchase. Whereas if you're trying to shoot a bullet, it's going to go right through, nothing happens. You know what I mean? Like, and leave those kind of things for them. Gosh, I know I said I was going to come back to, oh, ha, 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 ha. Okay. So there is a fun mechanic in Call of Cthulhu specifically that I really like to reward, and that's the sanity mechanic. And it's kind of what really sets that game system apart. And there are ways to work sanity into Dungeons and Dragons. There are some really great fits for how that works, and I definitely suggest playing with it. It's very fun. And it's not something that I like to destigmatize the loss of sanity in this game. I think that the loss of sanity should always be rewarded with intel. And so I use that as a way to drop seeds that explain the plot. And so as someone is losing something, they're also gaining a better understanding. And that is kind of what the loss of sanity perhaps is in a way. It's just open to like a different kind of knowledge. And so the Call of Cthulhu mechanics work really well with that, to where you can play into it and play into the stakes, but also use that as an opportunity to give them the key information that they need, whether they're hallucinating, hearing a voice that puts some of the puzzle pieces together as to like what happened in this haunted house, or if they are drawn to a certain part of the house that, oh god, I really need them to explore, but they're avoiding it. Like, you can use those innate mechanics to reach the goals that you need the players to reach, for them to be equipped to win in the end. Because that also, I have the entity's timeline in mind, but I want my players to be able to beat it. I want to give them everything they need to really win in the situation.
So I was thinking, by the way, I love everything you're saying. I think it's so important to think about, character actions and how you can guide them without forcing them.
Mm-hmm.
and I like playing in the sanity aspect of that. Because in D&D, like you said, there are workarounds, ways that people have worked that in, which is like some homebrewed rules, right?
Mhm.
Uh, but I'm curious, how how's your experience been with getting players to play into that fear, that mental instability? Like if they do fail a sanity check, and like have some of them pushed back, or have you had to encourage some of them to kind of lean into it more?
I that most players are so keen on the opportunity to play into chaos. Even your most like straight-laced, like logical, rational players, if you give them an opportunity to act against hype, I haven't met like a lot of resistance with that. Um, I think it is very heavy in role play, so I try to make them maybe a bit more comfortable with it is as I'm describing it, like I'll kind of like act out what they're experiencing a little bit. If they're like looking over their shoulder a lot, kind of like embody that kind of anxiety a little bit and really try to be as evocative as I can with the sounds and the voices and with all of that, so that they feel real unease that they're able to then carry into that. And yeah, I find most of the time people are so down for it, especially when they can do a heel turn and like they become an enemy to the other players all of a sudden because of some irrational kind of thinking, or not even irrational. It's very rational to them what they're experiencing. So um, that's a fun way to get people to engage and to maybe come out of their shell a little bit. But I do find like some players need a little bit of, I try to make them more comfortable by being ridiculous first, so that they don't
Yeah.
quite feel like they have to be the first one to get a little weird with it. I will always turn it up to 11 to kind of, you know, make them more comfortable with it.
Well, I think that is so great, and I love the concept of insanity, especially because in basically almost every TTRPG, definitely D&D, we face, well, our characters face some pretty mind-bending things. So
Yeah.
you mentioned you've seen people who have fit sanity or that kind of mechanic into games, but obviously you can do it wrong. So how do you go about doing it right versus some mistakes people might make?
That's a good question. I think, and I think it's twofold. I think one mechanically and two ethically. Mechanically, I think that I'm biased, obviously. I think Call of Cthulhu gets it so right. It has to be a percentile, and you have to be acquainted with the fact that you can only lose this. This is something you will. It's depreciating. And I like to raise the stakes with it, kind of very slowly, where maybe the first thing they see isn't quite so scary. It's only like a D4 penalty to their sanity, and build my way up through the dice, the suite of dice, until they come face to face with this thing, and all of a sudden they're taking a D20 hit to their sanity, and making that build up kind of uh gets the players always like a little uneasy, but also like a little, as they see that you're sharing information as this is happening, a lot of them get more bold and want to also learn that, even though it comes at a cost. So I think you have to be conscious in how you build. It's that slow build, that slow creep that is in every horror movie. Um, and so you kind of want to like give an inkling, and then all of a sudden it's the snowball that starts an avalanche, and then they're just taking penalty after penalty after penalty, and then it's like, and that frenzy is kind of fun in its own way. But I do think the percentile system is the best way to approach that. It gives you such a large threshold, um, Another fun thing I like to do is at the start of a game, I'll ask, "Oh, do you guys want to play on easy, medium, or hard?" And just kind of like a throwaway thing. And most tables are like, "Let's play hard mode. We know what we're doing." It's like, okay, we're gonna start out with a D20 penalty to your sanity. Everyone roll. And by kind of starting that a little bit lower, especially if you're doing a one shot, that's a way to kind of like start chipping away at that. Uh, and it also gets them acquainted with that loss up front. Um, that's something I like to do. I think that's fun. I think the other side of it is how to handle sanity ethically, and also approaching like these mental health mechanics in games in a way that is sensitive and a way that is um, not stigmatizing. And that too is why I feel very passionately that like a loss in sanity, quote unquote, should be rewarded with unlocking a new kind of knowledge or a new kind of sensory input. You know, maybe you're hearing something that the others can't hear, but that is, if you follow that, you're going to be rewarded with part of the story and a larger understanding of what's going on. And so using those things in a way that isn't so like stereotypical, and uh, and being sensitive to the fact, like not just settling someone with, for example, like I think people throw around OCD a lot, and trying to approach that more so in reality than just kind of what we see depicted as OCD, but instead giving someone real context for you have a compulsion, you can't fight it, it's gonna make you anxious if you do fight it. So you have to give in to this thing and you have no control over it. And I think that can lead to a lot of actual empathy for these very real things that exist.
That's very, very fascinating. I'm just thinking of like all the ways that, well, for one, that I've probably done this wrong, but that when someone has sort of an effect of having lost some of their sanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based on what you're saying, it sounds like you describe their feelings and their uh, impulses and instincts rather than you are depressed or you have schizophrenia. You know, like instead, you hear some things and the rest of the people around you don't seem to hear those things, which makes you feel strange or something like that, right?
Exactly. And 99% of the time, people who experience these things don't know that don't know what to call it.
Mm.
And so calling it schizophrenia or calling it depression doesn't really it's not as evocative as talking about the actual sensory input and the actual, symptoms. I talk about OCD because I myself have OCD, and so I am very sensitive to how it's portrayed a lot of the time, and just like, but I think genuinely running games has helped me so much with that. It's that same thing I was talking about with mm, OCD. A lot of the time is predicated on there's one correct answer. There's one right way to do things. I don't know what it is, but I know that there's one correct way to do it and it eludes me. And then that's starts this loop. And that's how I would approach writing games at first. And once things weren't going the one correct path that I had set for it, I would panic, absolutely. But now I think this like running games has been this like unintentional exposure therapy to where now I'm so excited when things go off book that I trust myself in that situation. I look forward to that situation and I'm not uncomfortable in that unknown. Um, and that has carried over a lot into my own life. So I say that to say anyone else out there who also deals with that, it's uncomfortable to kind of get over that hump when you're running games, but I'm telling you, it helps so much. And those are the kind of things that mm, you can play on in these sanity situations, so that like desire for like knowing what the right thing is and freezing up, and just kind of you can play with that rather than just saying, oh, you have OCD, and then all of a sudden they're like washing their hands every 5 seconds, and it's like, okay, that's like a facet, but that's not how everyone experiences it, but like whatever.
Mhm.
um yeah, I urge people to get creative and to, yeah, describe it as what they're experiencing rather than naming what they're experiencing.
I think that is overall just probably one of the best pieces of advice for most of the role playing experience, right? Describe what they're perceiving rather than, oh, you see, or you're in a bakery, right?
Yeah.
Um, unfortunately,
Smell of bread wafts
exactly.
over. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
so much better that way.
exactly. We are to time, unfortunately. But before we let you go, first of all, thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us for the second
Yeah,
time.
thank you.
You know, anytime, third time's a charm. So
Perfect. Well,
let's
actually,
do this again.
I was going to say I do want to have you back on the show because I don't know about Tanner, but I have some more questions I'd probably like to dig into.
Yeah,
Um,
too many.
yeah, still so
So
much to
many.
learn, honestly.
Absolutely.
But before we let you go, how can people reach out to you, support you, and see what you're up to?
You can find me across the internet at my name, Ashley May King, May May. Um, I am around. I stream on the Swole Initiative Network. I have some upcoming shows coming up with Do You Validate? And yeah, I've got some exciting things in the works that I can't even announce yet, but keep an eye on my socials and you will be in the know.
Excellent. And listener, please, if you get the chance, check out her social media and tell her thank you so much for coming on the show a second time. Just show her all the love you can. We would really appreciate that. But last thing, Ashley and also Tanner, um, please leave one last parting gift to our audience in the form of a practical tip or advice or do this based on everything we talked about or something we didn't talk about just to help them with their horror games or just being a DM in general.
I'll start. Um, I think I think a great way to do a horror sequence in D&D is to have them roll initiative, even when they're not in combat, and
Mm.
have them go turn by turn. It's a good way to give you a kind of a framework to make sure you're being descriptive enough with this, which in horror is very important.
Mhm.
Uh, and two, it gives them a sense of like dread that like, oh, why are
Mhm.
we going in turns? Uh, it and also allows you to throw in a nice little trapeoli, right, or something, just a little something in there. But at the very least, you're causing that suspense, and you're kind of making them chew on the situation and just mull it over. So that's my tip.
I think to echo that you should be as descriptive as possible. Keep all five senses in mind. I think we focus a lot on vision and what the players see, but make your monsters smell. Give them a smell, an odor that they can follow, or that they can, or leave some kind of, footprint or something tangible. Just really play on all of the senses, and that's what's really going to transport your players from the table to the haunted house or whatever you have put them in.
Amazing. When you said smell, I just imagined the worst smell I could, and that honestly conjured up an image of a monster. So, uh, excellent, excellent advice. Ashley, like I said, it's been wonderful having you here for the second time, and we do look forward for a third time. But listener, that'll have to wait. We'll be back next time with another handcrafted episode just for you. Until then, let's go ahead and roll initiative.